Hello, everyone. This is Kevin Jackson. This is part 6 in my series about early Christianity. In this episode, I'll be discussing the Modalist controversy, the Cappadocian Fathers, the Council of Constantinople, which takes place in 381 AD, the finalization of the New Testament Canon, which takes place in 391 AD, the conflict over the person of Christ, and this is largely a conflict between the cities of Antioch and Alexandria. Then we'll talk about St. Jerome of Stridon, and then Augustine of Hippo, and then their conflict with Pelagius. The picture at the bottom of the screen is an early picture of Constantinople, what it looked like back in the day. First of all, the modalist controversy. So in a previous episode, we talked about the Council of Nicaea, which addressed the heresy of Arianism, but it didn't address modalism. So if you recall from the earlier episode, Arianism was a teaching that Jesus Christ is a created being. He's not eternally God. And so it was a non-Trinitarian heresy, which lowered the person of Jesus Christ to be a human, or you could say an exalted God, but not he wasn't always God according to this heresy. But the council doesn't address the issue of modalism. So what modalism is the view that there is one God in one person who displays himself in different ways or different modes. And modalists use the council's decision at Nicaea to promote their views. But modalism is a rejection of the Trinity. And so at the Council of Constantinople in 381 AD, there is a condemnation of modalism. And we'll talk a little bit more about that council in Constantinople here in a bit. Just a note on modern day modalists, there's a group called Oneness Pentecostals, which have a belief real similar to what the ancient modalists had. And Oneness Pentecostals also believe that there is only one God in one person who displays himself in different ways. And a famous music group of Oneness Pentecostal is a group by the name of Phillips, Craig, and Dean. You may have heard of them before. And one thing I do want to mention here is even though I think Oneness Pentecostals are wrong about the Trinity and the nature of God, I still accept them as fellow believers. One thing that John Wesley said that I liked is it's more important the condition of your heart. Are you really seeking after God? And it's less important how clear your ideas are. And so I think that's relevant in this situation. The modalists, even though they're incorrect about the doctrine of the Trinity, they are still followers of Christ. Now, a little bit about the Cappadocian Fathers. The three Cappadocian Fathers are from Cappadocia, and you can see in the picture there on the right the map of basically the middle of modern day Turkey is where Cappadocia was located. So all three of these church fathers are from the middle of Cappadocia, and all three of them were friends and knew Athanasius. And we mentioned Athanasius in a previous episode, but all three of these guys are younger than Athanasius, and they're having their ministries at a later time. So Basil, Basil of Caesarea is sometimes called Basil the Great. He was alive from 330 to 379 AD. And then Gregory of Nyssa is the younger brother of Basil, and he was alive from 335 to 395 AD. And it's one thing of note is both of these brothers are influenced by their older sister, whose name is Macrina. And we mentioned Macrina in an earlier episode as well. She founded a monastery. And then Gregory of Nazianzus is a friend of both of them, and he lives between 329 to 390 AD. Basil is known as the man of action. Gregory of Nyssa is known as the thinker, and Gregory of Nazianzus was known as the orator. And all three of these guys make contributions to the doctrine of the Trinity. Some interesting facts is Basil went to school in Athens, a Greek school of learning, and that's where he met his friend Gregory, not Gregory, his brother, but the other Gregory. And Basil has, in his writing, has special emphasis about the Holy Spirit, and he's sometimes called the theologian of the Holy Spirit. And then Gregory of Nyssa was taught by Basil and his sister Macrina. He doesn't ever go to Greek school, but he's a genius in his own right. And his older brother Basil convinces him to become a bishop. And then Gregory of Nazianzus was apparently quiet and very shy. And he was not monastic like his brothers. So both Basil and Gregory, his brother, as well as their sister Macrina, were involved in the monastic movement, where this third Gregory was not. And he may have been married, but we're not sure either way. Anyway, Basil also convinces Gregory to become a bishop, sort of like he did for his younger brother. And eventually, the emperor Theodosius convinces him to become patriarch of Constantinople. And at this time, patriarch of Constantinople was a very important position. This was a position somewhat like the Roman Catholic Pope. But being that Gregory is a very quiet and shy person, he eventually resigns. It's just too much for him to be involved in such a heavy leadership role. And then I want to mention the First Council of Constantinople that takes place in 381 AD. This is hosted by Roman Emperor Theodosius. And an interesting fact about Theodosius is he is the last emperor of the unified Roman Empire. After his time, the Eastern and Western Roman empires split up into two. And at this council, they condemn both modalism and Arianism. Again, modalism was the teaching that there is one God in one person who displays himself in different ways, and Arianism was the teaching that Jesus Christ was a created being. And so both of those are condemned at this council. And this council also has a special focus on the Holy Spirit. Although Basil has already passed away at this point, he passed away in 379. This council uh, has a heavy focus on the Holy Spirit, and that comes from the writings of Basil to a large degree. And one thing I want to mention is that the concerns of this council and some of the earlier councils were something that the common everyday person cared about. There are notes where Gregory says people will come up to him in the street and ask him questions about why they're making decisions the way they are at the council and that sort of thing. So today people often don't care about theology or care about specifics dealing with the doctrine of the Trinity, but it seems at least at that time this was something that the common everyday person cared more about. And then also at this council, they update the Nicene Creed to the form that we have today. Oh, I want to mention this picture here too. This is called Christ Pantocrator, which is in Hagia Sophia and in modern day Istanbul. And it's a mosaic, pretty old mosaic, and a lot of the pieces are missing. But you can see there in the center you have Jesus Christ, and then on the left you have his mother Mary, and then on the right would be the Apostle John. And Christ Pantocrator means Christ Almighty. Now I want to mention the New Testament Canon. The New Testament Canon is going to be finalized at the Synod of Hippo in 393 AD, and that's the same Hippo where St. Augustine, or Augustine of Hippo, lives. We'll mention more about him in a bit. So earlier, the New Testament canon doesn't come out of nowhere. There's already a tradition before this time of the books that are important, but this canon finalizes that list and sets it more in stone. So earlier lists we have of the New Testament books include the Muratorian Fragment, which is from 170 AD, and that contains all but a few of the New Testament books. I think it's missing Hebrews and maybe some of John's letters. And then we also have a complete list by Origen in 230 AD, as well as a complete list from Athanasius, who would be alive, 30 years before this time. And so the New Testament canon is made official at the Synod in 393. And the canon includes all of the books of the Old Testament as well, all 39, and also the Apocrypha, the 7 books of the Apocrypha, or as Roman Catholics would call it, the deuterocanonical books. And one thing to note here is that during the Protestant Reformation, they're going to de-emphasize these books of the Apocrypha, and the Roman Catholic Church at the Council of Trent is going to reaffirm them. But throughout history, there's been disagreements over how important these books are. In fact, Jerome and Augustine, who we'll mention here in a bit, had different opinions on it. Augustine thought they should be included in the canon, and Jerome thought they should not be, as well as disagreement among Jewish people. Jewish people don't consider these to be 7 books to be part of the Torah. But at any rate, whatever you make of the Apocrypha, I think they're all interesting and they're useful and good to read. It's just the question comes down to whether or not they are inspired scripture. Next up, talk a little about the conflict over the person of Christ. And this comes down to, is Jesus both fully God and fully human? And today, Christians would say, yes, Jesus is fully God and fully human. But at this time, you have different groups with different emphasis. Some groups are more emphasizing the humanity of Jesus, and some groups are more emphasizing the divinity of Jesus. And so a couple of councils address this. The first is the Council of Ephesus, which takes place in 431 AD, addressing the issue of what's called Nestorianism. And Nestorianism was a teaching that Mary gave birth to a human boy, and then that human boy became indwelt by God at a later point, maybe when he was baptized. So Nestorians would not say that Mary was the mother of God. They would say Mary was the mother of a human boy who later on became God. And one other thing to note here is the Persian church, which you don't see on the map here. The Persian church is quite large at this time. The Persian church takes a different view and goes more the Nestorian view or direction. And this is in part because of conflict between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. They've been in conflict throughout their history. And so the Persian Empire and the Persian church is suspicious when councils that take place in part of the Roman Empire make decisions without them. So anyway, that's just a note that the Persian church takes a different route, a different road. And then there's the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD, and that addresses the issue of monophysitism. And so monophysitism rejected the human nature of Jesus and more focused on his divinity. So with monophysitism, they would say that Jesus could never have really sinned. So, when Jesus is tempted in the desert for the 40 days by Satan, was it possible for him to sin at that point? Or when Jesus is talking to the Father, praying to the Father before he's crucified, he asks if this cup can be taken from him. So the question is whether or not Jesus in his humanity could effectively had free will or not, and could Jesus sin or suffer as a result of that. And so the council decides that Jesus is both fully human and fully God. So Jesus genuinely did suffer, and it was possible for him to sin, although he did not. And then all of these issues are effectively conflicts between Antioch and Alexandria. And you can see on the map there where Antioch and Alexandria are. Alexandria is the purple dot there in Egypt. And then Antioch is the purple dot between modern day Turkey and Syria. And both of these groups are trying to jockey for influence in Constantinople, which is the head of the Roman Empire and the head of the church at this time. So anyway, Alexandria is focusing on the divinity of Jesus, and they are minimizing his humanity. Sometimes this view is called God in a bod. Anyway, they're focusing on Jesus' divinity, which is not to say they don't believe in Jesus' humanity, but they're focusing on his divinity. And then Antioch is focusing on the humanity of Jesus and minimizing his deity, and they are accused of adoptionism, or of the view where similar to Nestorianism, where Jesus was born human and later is indwelled by Jesus, or by the Logos. Anyway, so both of these groups, I think, really did believe in both the humanity and divinity of Jesus, but they are focusing on either one or the other. And unfortunately, both of these groups are not treating each other with the best intentions. They're presenting each other's views uh, uh, negatively and not treating them honestly. But anyway, so and this is going on because both groups are jockeying for positions in Constantinople and with influence in the empire. They want their bishops and their leaders to be appointed in various roles. And another difference you have between these groups is related to allegory. So allegory was the teaching where, particularly with the Old Testament, but the New Testament too, that when you read a passage, it has an obvious meaning, but then it has a hidden or secondary meaning as well. And so the Alexandrians use allegory heavily, and those from Antioch minimize allegory. So an example of allegory would be Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon. So in reality, this book is about a man and his lover. But if you take an allegorical reading of it, then it could be about Jesus Christ and his love for the church, for example. And so anyway, the church in Alexandria likes to apply allegory, and the church in Antioch doesn't. Next up, Jerome of Stridon, sometimes also called Saint Jerome. He was alive from 345 to 420 AD, and he was from Stridon. I put a red dot where we think Stridon was located, basically in modern day Croatia, but we don't know for sure because this is during the time when the Roman Empire is in decline, and there's Germanic tribes that come down from the north and raise Stridon at a later time. So we don't actually know where it is today specifically, but that's a general area. Anyway, so Jerome spoke Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic, so he was a very smart guy. And the interesting fact about Jerome is for him, the primacy of original languages is important. So what that means is when, for example, when we have a Bible translations today, for example, the New International Version of the Bible, when the scholars get together and translate it, they don't translate it from the King James. They translate it from the original sources, from the Hebrew and Greek original sources, and that you get a closer translation that way into English than you would if you went from secondary sources. So for Jerome, he has this view as well. So for him, it's important to understand these other languages, Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic, and read the Bible, read the Old Testament in its original Hebrew, not just the Greek Septuagint, and read the New Testament in Greek, not just in Latin. So when Jerome is going to become a translator, and when he's doing his translations, he's trying to do these from the original documents, or at least copies of the original documents in their original languages. So anyway, he's the first person who really takes this view that it's important to translate from the original language, and that's something that translators today always do. So Jerome does a new translation of the Bible into Latin, which is called the Latin Vulgate. And again, this was translating the Bible from the original languages. At that time, the Latin Bible they had was very poor translation, not very accurate. So Jerome is redoing this and from the original Greek sources and translating that into Latin. And the Latin Vulgate is used in the Roman Catholic Church throughout history up until about the 1960s when they start ending the Latin Mass. For a large period of time, that's the official translation of the Roman Catholic Church. And then Jerome is a monk and an ascetic. A monk, he's living in a monastery. An ascetic means he's living a simple life, praying, fasting, not having a lot of possessions, that sort of thing. A note about the picture here. There's a legend regarding Jerome. It's probably not true, but there's a legend that when he was in his monastery, a lion came to the monastery, and all the other monks ran away. But Jerome realized that the lion had a thorn in its paw, and so he helped take the thorn out of the lion's paw. And at least according to the legend, after that, the lion was a friend of Jerome and kind of hung out at the monastery after that. You'll also see in a lot of artwork regarding Jerome, there will be a picture of him with a skull, and I don't care for skulls, so I didn't put a picture here where it shows a skull. But anyway, that's to signify the mortal life that we none of us are going to live forever, at least not in our current life. Next up, Augustine of Hippo. So Augustine is one of the most famous church fathers in history. We know more about him probably than any other church father. In a large part, this is due to his writings in a work called Confessions. So Augustine is very transparent about his struggles in life, his struggles with his sexual drive and that sort of thing. And anyway, so we know more about Augustine of Hippo than any other church father from around that time. Originally, Augustine is attracted to something called Manichaeism, which is a similar belief to Gnosticism. It's a dualistic belief where there's a good and an evil in battle with each other, and where the physical world is bad and the spiritual world is good. So originally, Augustine is attracted to this view, but he becomes a Christian a little bit later on. And so his mother, Monica, was praying for him constantly as he was growing up and as he becomes an adult. During this time when he's not a Christian, his mother Monica is praying for him. She's a prayer warrior. And if you've heard of the city Santa Monica, California, that is named after Augustine's mother, Monica. And one other thing I will mention here is some people pronounce Augustine's name as Augustine, but I prefer Augustine. I think I'm used to that just because of the city, St. Augustine. So anyway, that's why I pronounce his name as Augustine, but just be aware that a lot of people prefer to pronounce it as Augustine. So anyway, Augustine converts to Christianity at the age of 31, and then he becomes Bishop of Hippo at the age of 41. And you can see Hippo on the map there is a little red dot, which would be in modern day Algeria. It's going to be close to Carthage as well. Carthage would be the city that's called Tunis now. But anyway, so he didn't really want to become a bishop. I think he was more interested in writing and that sort of thing. But people kind of dragged him into town and forced him to become Bishop of Hippo. And so he does. And as I mentioned, due to Augustine's transparency and his writings, we know more about him than any other father. One other note about Augustine is he was not fluent in Greek. He was all of his writings take place in Latin, and he knows some Greek, but he doesn't know it real well. Not at all like Jerome does. And then some of Augustine's views. First of all, he developed the doctrine of an original sin. This is the teaching that we're all born in sin from Adam. Adam and Eve sinned, and we inherit our sinful nature from them. And that's not to say that people before Augustine don't believe in original sin, but he expands on original sin and writes a lot about it and takes it in new directions, as we'll talk about here in a minute. Augustine believes in infant baptism. So when an infant is born, Augustine wants them to be baptized, and he says this is going back to original sin. Augustine says that infant baptism is needed to take away the guilt of original sin, and he goes so far as to say that if an infant dies without being baptized, that infant is not going to go to heaven, which I don't think most people today believe, but that's a view that Augustine held. Augustine advocates for celibacy or complete chastity. And as I mentioned earlier in Confessions, he talks a lot about the sexual sin and difficulties he had when he was younger. It's worth noting that Augustine had a relationship with a concubine for, I think it was 10 or 15 years, and he had a son with the concubine, and he actually wanted to marry her, but at this time, it was really difficult to marry people out of your class, and so he wasn't allowed by his mother or society in general to marry that concubine, even though he loved her because of her lower social status. And his mother Monica also tries to arrange a marriage for him, but he broke it off, and then he decides he's going to be celibate. And the the belief today in the Roman Catholic Church that priests should always be celibate, you can trace a lot of that back to Augustine. Although there's people before that teach it as well. You could even say the Apostle Paul does, but being a requirement is something that comes from Augustine. Augustine is famous for writing just war theory, and so he's saying that it's possible to both be a good Christian and a full Roman citizen to be a soldier. And he says that a Christian can become a soldier, and it's okay for a Christian to kill an enemy combatant if the cause is just. And one thing to note again here is this is during the decline of the Roman Empire. So you have these Germanic tribes invading from the north into Rome and into Dalmatia and places like that. And so there's a need for people to protect the empire. So Augustine works out his just war theory. And before this time, most Christians would be considered what we would call pacifist. But after just war theory, uh, Augustine's work there, more Christians see it as compatible to be a soldier. And today there's lots of Christians, at least in the United States, that become soldiers. Augustine also believes in something called delayed ensoulment. This was a teaching that when a person is first created, the fetus is first created in the womb, it doesn't have a soul initially. And Augustine said, that soul comes in at a later time, maybe I think 40 days. He said it in one location. So if the fetus, the first 40 days doesn't have a soul, and then that soul is imparted to the fetus at that time. And Augustine doesn't teach pre-existence of the souls like Origen did. He's just saying that a human gets their soul not initially, but a little bit later on down the road. And then Augustine writes a lot about predestination, and this is going to come up because of his conflict with Pelagius, which we will mention here in a bit. And predestination is eventually what becomes Calvinism during the time of the Reformation. Both Luther and both John Calvin and Martin Luther are big fans of Augustine, which is not to say they agree with everything Augustine wrote about, but predestination was definitely one of them that John Calvin did. And so predestination is a teaching that only the elect people will be saved. So the elect are people, Augustine says, God unconditionally chooses before they are born. So before the foundation of the world, before anyone has been created, God has already chosen who he's going to save and knew who he's not going to save. And Augustine says that salvation, anything related to salvation, is coming from God. Even when a person believes, that's coming about because of the way God works in their heart. Now, as a Wesleyan, I don't necessarily agree with this type of predestination that Augustine and then later Calvinists teach. But just to note that that is what Augustine teaches regarding predestination. And eventually this becomes very important to Calvinism. And then Augustine also teaches what many people today would consider to be Roman Catholic doctrines, such as salvation is in the Roman Catholic Church. He teaches the perpetual virginity of Mary. He teaches about purgatory. He teaches about intercession of the saints. But as I mentioned, during the time of the Reformation, folks like Luther and Calvin reject this part of Augustine's teachings, but they like other parts. And then, one thing I should mention too about the salvation in church is this is during the period. There's a group called Donatists or Donatism, and Donatists had a view that they were separate from the Roman Catholic Church, and they basically taught if you are baptized by a priest who was living a life of sin. Let's say, for example, you're baptized by a priest who is involved in sexual sin or something like that. Then the Donatists would say, well, that baptism was invalid. And some of this is coming back because of the history of persecution in the church. There were groups of Christians and priests, etc., who during times of Roman persecution would fall away from the church, and then when the persecution ends, they come back. And so the Donatists are concerned about these folks, whether or not they're genuine Christians. Anyway, so Augustine's involved in the argument against the Donatists. The Donatists are really big in North Africa at this time, where Augustine is related, and so that's where some of his doctrine about salvation only being valid in the Roman Catholic Church is coming from. And then Augustine is an amillennialist. This is a view that regarding the end times, that in Revelation, the 1,000-year reign of Christ. This Augustine would say that is a symbolic reign, and it's happening right now. During the time of Augustine, amillennialists typically believed there would be a 1,000-year reign of Christ. So, in the year 1000 AD or thereabouts, Christ would return. But later on, this becomes more of a symbolic 1,000 years. And so, according to amillennialism, right now, we're living during the reign of Christ. And then when Christ returns, then that will be the end of things. Now, the Pelagian controversy. So this is a controversy in between a man named Pelagius and then between Augustine and Jerome. So Pelagius was alive from 354 to 418. He is a monk from Britannia, or from modern-day Great Britain, and none of his writings survive. So it's really hard to say exactly what Pelagius believed, because we're only hearing from his critics. We're hearing from his critics of Augustine and Jerome, but we don't actually have his writings to review them. But according to Augustine and church leaders at that time, Pelagius denied original sin, which we talked about is a doctrine that all of us are born sinners, and we inherit our sin nature from Adam. And Pelagius emphasized human agency or free will in salvation. Pelagius is in a sense, he's trying to react to Manichaeanism. Manichaeanism is holding that dualistic view where there's an evil physical world and a good spiritual world. Pelagius is instead holds that everything, since everything's been created by God, everything is good, and so Pelagius can't really see how God has made, or how God has allowed humans to become fallen creatures. So that's the rub there. And I'd say, as a Wesleyan, I agree with Augustine that there is such a thing as original sin, and we all are in a state of depravity, and we need the grace of God to liberate us and bring us to a place where we can believe. The difference between the Wesleyan view and the Calvinist view would be over whether or not God is calling everyone, or if he's only calling a few people to be saved and to believe in him. And then if a person believes, is it because or if a person doesn't believe, is that because God has withheld grace from that person, which would be the Augustinian view, or is it because they reject God gave them every opportunity, but they rejected salvation? So anyway, for myself, I would consider myself to be closer to Augustine than to Pelagius, but not strictly Augustinian. So most Wesleyans are not Augustinian in that way. Anyway, so Pelagius' views are condemned at the Council of Carthage in 418, and Pelagius had conflicts with both Jerome and Augustine, and then the views that Augustine writes on relating to monergism and predestination are in large part a response to Pelagius. But what I would say is Augustine went too far the other way, trying to get away from Pelagius. He went too far. Anyway, that is the end of this episode. I hope you have enjoyed it. If you'd like to leave a comment or correct me on anything, feel free to do that. Thanks for listening.